Now, the plan for today is that I'm hoping that we are actually going to complete the safety course today. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen first of all. Right. And can you all see that? That's the safety course, yeah? And now, because it's a little while since I actually, because we missed last week because it was Juliana's birthday, am I right in thinking that we had completely finished module 6? Give me a thumbs up if we did, yeah? Went back through the video and it looked to me as if we had covered all of that. So it means that we're on to this module here, the training and injury prevention and management. So effective training systems will provide a sound environment for athletic progression and skill development. So I've got a little video here.
Chloe's learned things that I don't think most children could learn of a normal ability. Having children with autism can be a very lonely world. When you're in a world, should we say, like this, where lots and lots of parents understand the way that your children are, you know, that the friendships that you make is just amazing.
I like the little videos. I hope you like them too. But what it really sort of is seeking there to highlight is that everyone is entitled to a training program, even if they've got additional needs and challenges. And it's amazing what can be achieved by the individuals if they do actually have a proper training plan. And we've had skaters who started with us back in, our very first skating competition in 2012. And, they're now competing internationally and they've made huge progress. Grant and Lucy also, Jane Torval, mentioned that she hadn't seen the way that you were using the wheelchair, and Grant was doing spins in the opposite direction as you were weaving your way around him. It's amazing what these skaters can achieve if you give them the opportunity to do it. And it all depends upon having good training programs. But what we're always trying to do is to prevent avoidable injuries and make sure that we're providing a safe environment. So what we're actually looking to do is asking all the volunteers to make sure that they comply with certain criteria. And these are the sorts of things that we're looking for them to do. We want them to conduct a safe session. Sounds obvious, but in actual fact, it's probably more difficult than you realise. Ensure that the field of play and the environment is safe and that there's a safe system of working for all the skaters and participants. So that means that you've actually got to review what you're doing and the environment that you're working within. And if, for example, just now you were doing inline skating, it might mean that you've got to spend a bit more time looking for things like stones and doing a little bit more work. So whatever the environment is that you're working within, you're always going to have to make sure that it's a safe system for what you're actually seeking to do. Make sure that you're using suitable equipment, and bearing in mind, if you're doing things inline, then that might mean that you may have to wear helmets, elbows, wrist guards, much more than you might do on the ice. On the ice, you tend to slide falls so that there's less injuries, but on the ground, wrist injuries are really commonplace. So make sure that you're always wearing the suitable equipment for the activity that you're actually doing. Ensure that the equipment is suitable, fits properly, and is in sound working order, which means every time you bring it out to use it, you've got to check. We also ask the volunteers not to provide travel and accommodation, okay, which seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's something that is very commonly done across a lot of different sports. But we've got very high standards of safeguarding, so we actually put this into the criteria: do not take responsibility for the travel and the accommodation. If, for example, you were going away on a Special Olympics trip, the coaches actually become the volunteers and actually look after the athletes when they're away at competitions. You'll never be asked to do that at inclusive skating. We will always, when we're running events, doing any sorts of activities, keep the skaters within their own household community bubble. And we will not be asking the coaches and the volunteers to take any responsibility for travel and accommodation of the skaters and the participants. Okay, which is very different. I think I may have mentioned this before. Also, to able-bodied competitions, they separate the skaters from the parents and carers. We don't, and it's the biggest difference between the way that we run competitions. And the same thing applies also in relation to all the training. Okay, so no travel and no accommodation. Make sure that you implement a well-planned programme. Leaders, coaches and volunteers should work together to ensure that all practice sessions and events are well supervised. And that takes quite a bit of organisation and planning, because usually you're not going to be on your own when you're organising an inclusive skating session. You're going to have a team of people there. You're going to have at least one, very good, properly qualified coach, but you're going to have people also doing the welcome. You're going to have people helping you with equipment. So you've got quite a lot of people to manage. So that is something which takes a lot of communication skills between all the different individuals. And it also means that you've actually got to communicate both your sort of top down, but also ensure that there's communication between each of the different layers themselves. Whatever possible, medical personnel should be available and or readily available at a local facility. So that means that you've got to know things like, for example, where the first aid room is. You're going to have to know if there's a hospital nearby, what's the emergency contact number. And it could apply, bearing in mind, in the UK, we're very fortunate because we've got a National Health Service. But if you were taking people away to a skating competition and you're the coach on the ice with the skaters, you've got to make sure that you know what the systems and the protocol are in relation to the hospital facilities. Okay. So the elements of an effective training system and the modifications that are necessary to increase safety could include some of the following things, and these are just suggestions, and it's not an exclusive list. These are things that you can add to. Okay, you must implement an appropriate assessment of athlete readiness and skill. So you've got to select an appropriate starting point and provide continual review. Sounds very obvious, but you do actually have to know what the current position that athlete is at that point in time. So you don't just take them onto the ice and then just, have a voyage of discovery. You've got to know what's going to happen to that skater before you actually take them on the ice, to make sure that you're setting the activities appropriate to that skater before they even start. We also ask our people to implement a training programme for year-round fitness, so that you're fostering positive health behaviours and physical preparation for activity. Now, a lot of people might not realise this, but when you're entering an inclusive skating event, we expect you to have followed a training programme. And in fact, if you read the small print, you'll actually see it written there. So we're not looking for people to turn up and have their first time on the ice at the skating competition. What we're looking for is for there to be a training plan and a programme, and then you go through your training programme and plan, and then the competition is at the end of it. And it's there effectively as a way of you having something to work towards. And so it's really important that you do actually foster overall health benefits, because that's actually more important to the skater, that they're actually fit and healthy. We want the training plan to be person-centred, so that it's looking at that individual. So yes, you may have a generic plan, which is, gives you a bit of a base for a starting point, but it's always got to be focused on the individual needs of that particular athlete, and it's got to look at what they actually need. And so I've said that the training plan has got to be individualised for each skater to develop the appropriate skills and conditioning for the sport. So you're wanting them to develop both skills, but also to make sure that they've got health benefits that arise from the sport. We want you to make sure that with each individual skater, you complete the registration of the skater on the inclusive skating platform and disclose all the relevant medical and emergency information. And that can be extremely important, because very often, if you don't fill it up at the time, at the very beginning, it never gets filled up. So make sure that you're always getting all the relevant medical and emergency information onto the registration platform. It really does matter. You've got to make sure that there's first aid kits and emergency equipment available at all practice sessions. So Mary, if you're actually setting up, or Bronwyn, if you're setting up new activities at a new rink, you've always got to effectively make sure that you've got your first aid kit. Now, I know that lots of the rinks are very well it's stocked in terms of first aid equipment, but don't rely upon that just in case someone's gone in and wiped the cupboard clear. Make sure that you've actually got everything that you actually need as well, so that you've got a bag And for example, when I go to the inclusive skating session at the time capsule, when we've been running them, I've got a bag at the ready and it contains all of our first aid kit. And I know that they've got it in the first aid room, but I've got it too. So always make sure that you've got your own first aid kits. Acclimatisation to the environment is recommended. Now, this might seem quite like an innocuous thing, but with a lot of our athletes, they're quite unstable and they might not be good at doing things like changing temperature. So do be very mindful of the fact that you've actually got to acclimatise them. And sometimes some of the rinks can be very, very cold. And sometimes they can be warmer than expected. So you've actually got to make sure that when they're actually taking part on the ice, that you keep tabs on whether or not they're actually adjusting to that environment, and making sure they do things like have layers of clothing that they can take on or off. Skaters should gradually adjust to changes in temperature and be continually monitored. Prompt skaters to layer clothing and ensure hydration at all times. Seek to keep the skaters in a stable environment and at a stable, safe temperature at all times. And that's really important because very often the hypothalamus, which regulates temperature, is something which is quite weak in our skaters. So make sure that that if you keep them stable, then you're actually making it easier for them to keep their whole system stable. So it's actually more important than you realise. And the same thing, if they overheat, you've got to make sure that they are allowed to cool down carefully. Skaters who are not accustomed to exercising at high altitude should adjust carefully over a period of 10 to 14 days. Exercise should increase gradually in both length and intensity, and altitude sickness may occur if the skater has not made the adjustment. Symptoms can include nausea, vomiting, dizziness, shortness of breath, and flu-like symptoms. Skaters who cannot adjust to the environment at the event, for example, temperature, altitude, glare, noise, etc., can always compete through pre-recorded video entry using a safe environment. So we don't exclude them from the event, we would just give them an alternative method. Bear also in mind sun or snow blindness. If you were skating outdoors and or during outdoor training activities, skaters should wear dark glasses with lateral shields, and glasses should have ultraviolet blocking. Skaters with reduced vision and glare should use an alternative venue for the event. And that can be a particular problem if, for example, we were doing inline skating or you were at an outdoor, it could even be something fun. Maybe, for example, we're looking to take the skaters away to Switzerland, and they might be set up some fun activities at the local outdoor ice rink. Bear in mind, if you're doing anything at all with these skaters, that you take on board the fact that if they go into bright sunshine, it might have a bigger impact. And it might also result in them getting sunburn. And skaters should wear long sleeve clothing and protect their skin if exposed to the sun during their training or activities, and sunscreen should be used as necessary. And that can be a particular problem for inline skating because a lot of our lot are used to being on the ice. They're not necessarily used to being outside, so they might forget. And if you're moving, it's keeping you cooler because the wind is actually helping to keep your temperature down, but you might still get sunburn. So make sure that you're keeping a good eye on them. Wind can also be a problem because it can increase chills, dry skin, and eye irritation. Use proper clothing and protect the body and body parts with glasses, eye drops, limb balm, etc. as necessary. Also ensure that athletes with contraindications for an activity select alternative activities that are safe and appropriate for them. For example, skaters with Down syndrome may present with axial instability, and they should not hyperextend the spine. Now, with it's called AAI for short. If skaters have got AAI, then very often it will have been assessed, but not always. Sometimes even the people with Down syndrome may not have had the formal, diagnosis done or the test done to ascertain whether or not they've got it. So just be careful. We've got a lot of athletes who've got Down syndrome who may have AAI, or alternatively, we may have people who've got a lot of hypermobility in their joints. So even although they may be able to do things like hyperextend the spine, don't let them. Okay, it's your responsibility to impose, some restrictions on them, because safety for our skaters matters more than anything else. If you look at the able-bodied skaters, you'll see, like these little Russian girls and the legs up here and the heads there, and they're doing massive, extension of the spine. too dangerous with our law, don't ask them to do it. Really make sure that you're erring on the side of safety. So implement an emergency management plan, whatever that's appropriate as well. And this takes you through some of the key stage in an emergency management plan. The first thing to do is to assess the situation as quickly as possible. What is the actual emergency that you're dealing with? Make the assessment in the location to determine if the person who's had the injury, for example, can be safely moved. Evaluate the criticality of the situation and take appropriate action. The primary survey is always airway, breathing, circulation and consciousness. Okay, so that's when you would implement, your first aid techniques to make sure that the person was breathing, and you put in place that emergency response. The secondary survey evaluates the seriousness of all the other injuries. So make sure that you always think the primary one first of all, before you then move on to the secondary one. If you've got a medical professional available, then always refer to them. If the person and the personality of the individual who's got the injury is known, judge their reaction during the assessment procedure. So, for example, you may not know that someone's a drama queen, and that might influence your decision, if they're sort of doing that. But if but even if the person is a drama queen and they're collapsed on ice, still assess them. Don't make any assumptions, because it might just be the one time that they've got something. Refer to the athlete's medical information or the person's medical information wherever known, and check also for medical alert bracelets or the person's phone for medical alerts. And what you'll find is that most people nowadays will actually have some of this information on their person, or they'll have it on their phone. And in fact, I'm not sure if I can show you at the same time as sharing screen. I might be able to. The next thing to do is make sure that throughout this whole process, you're staying calm. If other skaters and persons are being upset, then ask the others to move away and keep the area around the injured person clear. And you've seen that time and time again. Someone falls over on the ice and everyone lands on top of them to try to make sure that they're okay. Keep them away, because you want the person who's actually got the injury to stay quite calm, and you want to keep them, you want to preserve their privacy as well. They might get upset if everyone's watching them. Listen to the description of what happened by the injured person. That can give you quite a lot of information. So if you've done your primary assessment and the breathing and you've moved on to your secondary ones, then make sure that you're actually listening to that injured person. Ask simple clarifying questions. That can be really helpful. Observe the person's face and their eyes whilst talking, and that can be really helpful because you'll see whether or not there's been any head injury, you'll get any potential for concussion. Observe for any asymmetry, trauma, general body alignment and functional abilities. For example, can they move their arm? And that can be particularly important if the person has maybe had a stroke. Because bear in mind, when you're actually running your sessions, what I find typically is that we very rarely have accidents with the skaters on the ice. What we've often found is that it's been the parent or the carer off the ice that's actually had the emergency response. And you've got to deal with that emergency response in the exact same way as you deal with the skaters. And we've actually, whilst I was curling, we've actually had a person have a stroke, during a curling session that I was there. And I immediately called 999 because I noticed some asymmetry. It was very clear to me the person was having a stroke, and that got the team on board very, very quickly. So things like asymmetry can be really helpful in assessing whether or not the person's got a stroke. There are some serious conditions that require medical attention. You want to assess, for example, significant swelling or dislocation of an extremity, obvious deformity of an arm or leg, severe pain, inability to bear weight on a lower extremity, lacerations with or without fractures, significant swelling, loss of sensation in an extremity. So those are all serious conditions, and those are the sorts of ones that you really want to be taking the person to hospital. Conditions mandating that only an experienced medical professional move the person are things such as loss of consciousness, neck or back injury with loss of sensations of motor power in arms or legs, and head injury with visual changes and or disorientation. And that can be quite an important thing because falls are commonplace on the ice. And so that's the sort of thing that can be a quite difficult judgment call, is whether or not you can actually move the person from the ice, or whether or not you've actually got to wait for someone to come and actually move them. So make sure that, if there's any possibility of any of those, loss of consciousness or any types of back injuries or neck injuries, don't move them. Make sure that you get the experienced team there and on board. Ensure that a responsible person stays with the injured person at all times. Okay, so make sure that even if, for example, you've put in place, the emergency response to get, the emergency resuscitation, and you're doing, airway breathing, etc. Always ask for help. Make sure that you've got someone else there with the person, even if someone else is calling for help and is maybe doing a CPR on the person. Make sure that there's someone there at all times and they never get left. When in doubt, do not put the skater back on the rink. And very often, I've seen this time and time again, I've even seen it at major skating competitions. Do you remember the time when we had Yuzuru Hanyu, who had that major accident on the ice, and he was allowed to take part in the competition immediately afterwards? I don't know if you remember that one. She'd never been allowed. With that level of an injury, the person that's the referee or someone like myself needs to step in and say, sorry, can't do. You may have concussion, you may have a serious injury, because they then may go on to have an even more serious injury. So be prepared to err on the side of caution and make sure that the person remains safe. So implement the crisis management and communication plan when necessary. All activities should be calmly and simply explained to the injured person. So in other words, tell them what you're going to be doing. If you've had to call an ambulance or whether or not you're getting, someone to come in and help, make sure that you're always communicating to the injured person and keeping them informed. Make sure that you've contacted the emergency services by telephone immediately. Ensure that the emergency services and medical responders have access to the injured person. And that can be quite important because sometimes within an ice rink, access to the rink may be difficult. So do you remember the time when I was saying that, I'd called the ambulance because the person had had a stroke at Braehead? And you've really got to then pass it over to the team at Braehead so that they can direct the ambulance into the best entrance to be able to come in with the equipment that they're going to bring in, because they'll be bringing in a stretcher and such like. So make sure that the lines of communication are open and they know where the entrances are and which are the best ones to be and where exactly you are. Use the first aid room if at all possible, and at all times ensure the comfort and privacy of the injured person. And that can be quite something to do on the ice, because if the person's had an injury on the ice, it might be cold. So make sure that if you can't move them, that you put some sort of screen up around them. Use the first aid room. Parents and carers should be notified immediately and provide immediate care and follow-up. And bearing in mind with the inclusive skating system, the parent and carer should be there, so that should be fairly easy to do. But it might not be with, just in case someone has left someone, looking after someone, make sure that you actually phone everyone up. It may be more than just one person that you need to contact. All illnesses and injuries should be recorded in the accident book. Now, that's actually a requirement of the insurance policy. So with inclusive skating, there's actually the standard one that's recommended, under the health and safety regulations. That's the one that we actually use. And you've actually got to have that at all the sessions. So make sure that you've got an accident book and that you actually fill it in. And in relation to the insurance policy, you've got to make notification of any serious injury that's notifiable within 24 hours. So you do have to take some follow-up action and know any changes in risks for future participation. So as soon as there's been an accident or there's been any sort of an emergency, make sure that you review what you've actually done to make sure that you make changes, to make sure that you've met the absolute safety standards that you can, and whether or not you need to consider making additional changes. Okay. Now, what I've got here now is, after all of that really important stuff, I've got an example of a coaching plan for a 6-week session, because one of the things that you've been asked to do is to have a coaching plan. So here's an example of what could be an outline coaching plan for starting a group of beginners within inclusive skating over a 6-week period, because that's what everyone is usually wanting to do when they come to inclusive skating. So before the season starts, what you want to do is you want to get everyone to attend the coaches training, take the online courses, arrange for facility use and timing of the sessions, hold orientation and assist with induction and assist with equipment as required. So all of that should be done to manage the start of the new skaters, and consider throughout all of this a phased introduction of new skaters. Start new skaters only when there are enough volunteers available to provide sufficient support. And bearing in mind, what we recommend is that when you start any one new skater, that you've got at least one dedicated volunteer to look after each individual skater. So if you were starting the average beginner course, if it was able-bodied children, normally you'd have one coach to 15 kids, maybe 10 to 15, with maybe, if you were lucky for the beginners, 1 or 2 helpers. With inclusive skating, what we recommend is much higher ratios, that for the first week on the ice, each individual inclusive skater will have a dedicated volunteer to help them on the start. So that means that you will probably not have enough volunteers available to start all of the skaters at the same time. So you may have to start some skaters in week 1, some skaters in week 2, and potentially also in week 3. So in week 1, you welcome the skaters, you use signage and orient them to the facility, review the safety procedures and policy, check the equipment being used by the skaters, make sure that they warm up, stretch, balance, check the balance of the skaters because it can vary from one day to the next, assess the skaters' level, direct volunteers to assist the skaters as necessary, and teach basic skating skills and cool down. And that's quite a lot to get through in week 1. In week 2, you're still going to be welcoming new skaters and going through that same process, because not everyone will have started in week 1. So you've still got that welcome to do for all of the new skaters. And at the same time, is you're going to be practicing the previously taught skills to the skaters that were able to start in week 1. And it's important to bear in mind that, when you're doing the assessment for the skaters, with these skaters, it's really good idea to assess the skaters every single week. So you don't just do your assessment of how they are in week 1 and then forget about it, like I've ticked that box. Always review the skaters that are inclusive skaters every single time that you see them. In week 3, that's when we would recommend that you would welcome any remaining new skaters. You would hope for the size of the group that you were hoping to start, that you would get them all started within the first 3 weeks, because it would be better, I think, after that stage to then effectively put the next lot into a new block. And you may very well have to do several blocks. You may not be able to meet all the demand that you have at the beginning. So it's a really good idea to ensure that you don't have, and I've had this happen at the time capsule. We had a busload turn up unexpectedly with 25 disabled ice skaters, expecting us to take them on the ice for the first time. And you can't do that. You haven't got enough volunteers to ensure a safe system. So you can welcome them in to have a look around the facility and to orient them, but you certainly can't start 25 new skaters on the ice on the same day. It does need to be a planned experience. So go through the same procedures of reviewing safety procedures, assessing skill level, teaching basic skating skills to the new skaters, and practicing previously taught skill. And then hopefully by the time you would get to about week 3, you would be able to begin to group the skaters according to ability level and teach them new skills as appropriate. And the learning speed of the skaters can vary hugely with inclusive skating. Within the badge programme, we've got 3 different tiers. So at the end of this, certainly next week, we're going to go through the badge programme, and we're going to go through how you assessed what would be an appropriate starting point for different types of skaters within the different tier programme. Okay. In week 4, you would warm the skaters up, stretch, check their balance again, assess their skill level, and direct the volunteers to assist the skaters as necessary. And at this sort of stage, you would be hoping you would be beginning to make some real progress with the skaters, because by this stage, most of them would have dealt with most of the safety issues, and that they're beginning to actually make some progression. And again, start grouping the skaters according to ability level and teaching them new skills. Week 5, you would warm them up, go through the same process, assessing their skill level, getting your volunteers to assist them and teaching them the new skills. But by that stage, you would also be preparing them for their assessment or their performance of the skills for the following week. And in week 6, you would be hoping by this stage that they would maybe be able to maybe get a badge at this stage. Now, the inclusive grading system is designed to ensure that everyone can get at least one badge, okay? And by that, I mean like a certificate, so that you should be able to give them some sort of an award, and that they should be able to perform some new skill of what they've actually done. And bearing in mind, we'll discuss, how that can actually apply, because we've got quite a few skaters who have got autism, and it might take them a couple of weeks to even get in the building, because some children really struggle to be able to enter into a new environment and even feel the cold. But hopefully with even with those children, we should be able to give them some sort of certificate, because I've got that built into the system. Okay, when you're doing the presentation, make it fun. Present the awards, take photos, let them cool down, and potentially even, have some sort of snack or meal, so that you make it a social time and that it's fun. And many times have you seen us at inclusive skating competitions, and I set things up? Do you remember when we did the Scottish, Grant and Lucy, and I organised that afternoon tea for afterwards, right? Make it fun. It's really important that everyone really enjoys it. Following the season, this is an example of a 6-week programme. Continue training the skaters. Make sure you thank everyone. Thank your volunteers. Thank the leaders and the assistant coaches. If at all possible, do things like send photos. Do a follow-up media story to the press. Very difficult for people to have like a time when, something has actually happened. And unless you take a photo of it, people forget. So, take the time to take a photo or two. Ensure that there's always consent, particularly if you're going to do anything with the press. Never assume. And then make sure that you evaluate the season and develop the season plan for the next session. One of the things that has really happened with inclusive skating is that after each season has taken place, whether or not it's a competition or it's been a training, I spend quite a lot of time talking to the skaters and making sure that we're meeting their needs. So, for example, things like having gender neutral changing rooms, they happen because I listen to feedback. Feedback is your friend. So make sure that you have a conversation. And I think, yes, you can do MailChimp and you can do, SurveyMonkey and all of these other things, but nothing beats actually having a chat with people to find out whether or not there were other things that you could have done to meet their needs. So make sure that you communicate with people and that you enter into a conversation about what they actually want. Right, so the next heading is first stage. So these are the sorts of things that you want to have in the first stage, right? And I always think they're really important, so I never make an assumption. So make sure that you've got the accident book, you've got the first aid kit, and you've got a protocol. Volunteers in sessions should have an accident book, a first aid kit, and an emergency protocol available at all times. Make sure that you've got trained volunteers and coaches, and ensure that they're trained in first aid, that someone is trained in first aid and is available at all sessions. So for example, with inclusive skating, we get everyone to do first aid courses. So for example, every year or two, even me, I'm taking my first aid course and asking people to continually keep themselves updated. Because with things like CPR, unless you're actually practicing it regularly, it is difficult to do. So we really do encourage all leaders and coaches to be trained in first aid, and we do actually apply for funding. So if people are struggling to find money to take the first aid course and they would like to do it, let us know, because we'll find funding from somewhere to finance you taking the course. And we recommend taking courses with people like St Andrews or St John's or similar levels of organisations such as the Red Cross, because they do have like good quality ones. And particularly for things like CPR, it's a really good idea that you actually go to a physical course. I think it's great to do online ones as well, might I add, so that you can do them as well as, but I think having done at least one live in-person course where you're actually practicing the CPR is a really good idea. Make sure that you've got reporting. If an accident occurs, it must be recorded in the accident book, and it must be recorded to inclusive skating and our insurers within 24 hours. I think I already told you that. Another really important area, which is often ignored, is concussion. And you must know what to do if concussion is suspected. Concussion must always be carefully managed, and bearing in mind that wearing a helmet does not protect against concussion. Anyone suspected of having a concussion must be sent to hospital as soon as possible. because any impact that causes a sudden jolting of the head and results in the brain moving inside the skull may cause a concussion. After concussion, the skater should return to activities after the physical and mental rest recommended and a doctor has given clearance. Do not let the person come back on unless they've been cleared to come back. Concussion is serious and you do not want their judgment to be impaired. So with concussion, really, really be careful. Now, make sure that concussion can have a delayed onset. So even if you've got any suspicion at all that the person might have concussion, make sure that you observe them continually, because the person might appear normal at the beginning, but they may not be okay. They may in actual fact have a delayed onset concussion. So make sure that you monitor them. And if you've got any concerns at all, you make sure that you know who's going to be taking that person home and looking after them. Okay. Now, the symptoms of concussion are headache, dizziness, feeling dazed, seeing stars, sensitivity to light, ringing in ears, tiredness, nausea, vomiting, irritability, confusion or disorientation. The signs of concussion: poor balance or coordination or slurred speech, poor concentration, delayed response to questions, vacant stare, decreased ability, unusual emotions, personality change, inappropriate behaviour or sleep disturbance. Now, if you see any of that either at the time of the accident or subsequently, that's when you may potentially have concussion. Get them to hospital and get them seen to straight away. Okay. Any questions on that? No. No. And I think one of the most important things is, because bear in mind, we do recommend the use of helmets, but the helmet will not protect you, okay, in the event of a concussion. Right. So the safety team. Now, this is what we look for within the sporting environment, within inclusive skating. And by the end of this module, you should be able to promote a good, safe and healthy sporting environment. You should be able to remind skaters and volunteers that a safe environment is their responsibility too. So even the skaters have got a duty to ensure safety. Don't just regard them as being the recipients of safety, involve them in the process as well. Reinforce the need for an identified responsible person to lead the session. I think that's really important, and it's something that often gets missed within skating, because very often each of the coaches will be operating as distinct entities, or a club will be running the activity and they'll see themselves as being like, I'm the chair of it, right? So I should be in charge. They're in charge of the club, but they're not necessarily in charge of the session because they may not have the skills. The person who is in charge of running the session should be someone who's trained in safety and has got sufficient knowledge and skill to manage the actual coaching session. And that may not be the chair or the club or the committee members. So make sure that the person is appropriately qualified for the task that they're actually doing. Make sure that you can explain the basics of the role of the volunteers and the coaches, and you can explain the basics of the role of the leader. Now, the leader is not a concept that I've seen too often in this country, but I have seen it elsewhere. And for example, it's very prevalent in places like Canada. So the general advice is there should be a commitment to the following aspects of the role. Ensure that all safety procedures and checks are being completed. And bearing in mind, a safe environment promotes confidence for everyone in participation, so everyone benefits. And a safe training environment and community spirit can include the whole family, and it can really transform lives. And we've got a little video.
Confidence-wise, it's boosted Gracie massively, but also physically. Gracie was at one point, she couldn't walk very far without her knees dislocating, and she'd walk along and then just drop. So now we can walk around. She's not dislocated and hasn't done for about 4 months now, which is a huge difference. It's just great. We've got something to do. We've made up new friendship groups. We've more of a social life. There's lots of things about it that I enjoy it as much as she does.
And bear in mind, you're responsible for her safety too. So mum's safety matters just as much as children's safety. Okay, but it's great to have the families involved. It's a lovely atmosphere if you've got everyone involved. But if you're the person responsible for the session, you've got to do all the admin, and you've got to do things like ensure that DBS and PV checks are carried out as necessary. So all the volunteers and coaches must be DBS or PVG checked or equivalent. And we provide checks, and we actually do that through a couple of different systems. Through Volunteer Scotland, we're actually a disclosure partner, and also through the Welsh Sports Association. They've got Vibrant Nation, and they can do the checks in over 150 countries. So that's how we do them. And the law is changing in Scotland. Before, you were able to rely upon PV checks done by a national governing body. That's no longer enough, and all the organisations have now got to, or once this legislation comes into force later this year, we've all got to do our own checks. So you'll actually see inclusive skating, sending requests for everyone to be able to get their checks done through us. But we'll do it because most of you are working with us as volunteers. We get it at a reduced rate, but we will be asking for it to be done. What we ask all our volunteers and coaches and leaders to do is to ensure that they've got continuing competence to identify and manage safeguarding issues, and that must be demonstrated at all times. So you've got to be continually alert to safeguarding issues and be able to identify and activate a chain of reporting and management should an issue arise. So whatever the session is that you're taking part in, know that before the session begins, if you're, for example, a new young coach or you're a volunteer leader, if something happens and I've got a safeguarding concern, who do I contact? Is it Margarita that I would speak to? Is she then going to progress it to the police? Who will she refer the matter to? Make sure that you've got a chain of command so that you actually know what you should do if you've got a concern. All participants should seek to participate in safety, and this includes safeguarding training and awareness. Now, wherever possible, courses and training should be available for the whole of the inclusive skating community at all times. And relevant information is available on the Inclusive Skating website and should be regarded as training materials. I don't know, have any of you actually looked at the safeguarding materials that we've got on the website? I've got loads, absolute piles. Now, they are actually regarded as part of your training materials. So if you've got the time, make sure that you read them, because it's got things, for example, like stories and scenarios that will help you to work through potential safeguarding issues. We've also got access to lots of additional courses. So, for example, people that we know that are designated safeguarding officers for various of our clubs, we invite them to take online courses or courses at different venues for safeguarding. So there's plenty of training out there that's available through a whole range of different systems. And there's also online ones as well. So make sure that if you haven't done one already and you would like to do one, put your hand up and we'll potentially also fund you actually taking the course as well, because we really encourage everyone to be trained in safeguarding. So everyone's encouraged to take the courses. And also what you should do is, if you've got any safeguarding qualifications on the platform, you'll actually see that there's a couple of different options for you to upload safeguarding certificates. So make sure that you actually upload them. I'll probably show you some of mine. So make sure that if you've taken courses, pop them onto the platform, because it's really helpful for us to know. And it also provides a good way of you recording your qualifications, right? So what should you do as an advisor? You should help participants to become good decision makers. And that's really important, because very often people, maybe with ADHD and such like, they're not good decision makers. They're going to take risks when they shouldn't. So you've actually got to do a little bit of education. And so be prepared to get into a conversation to help them on the journey to being safe. Help participants to see the impact of the decisions they make by looking into the future at the potential consequences of that decision. So, for example, if they are like pushing, the penguins around and they're targeting them at anyone, that might actually make someone else frightened and it might upset them. So make sure that you actually make people aware of what is the potential for those particular activities. Help skaters to achieve safely using their own efforts. So do no harm. It's that sort of adage that the doctors always say, don't do any harm. So what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to get the skaters to help themselves and use their own efforts. Don't barge in, don't make assumptions, don't pull people around. Make sure that you're always helping them and supporting their particular journey, and you're encouraging their own efforts. Help skaters to be proud of their own achievements and efforts. right? And that's really important, because what they've done that day, if they've tried really hard, reward them. Say, good job, that you really tried hard today. That was really good. Don't expect them to be perfect immediately. Tomorrow is another day. So if there's things that they want to achieve and you want to encourage them to have something to come back to practice, tomorrow's another day. That could be tomorrow's work. Help the participants to take responsibility for their own actions. Okay, so it's really important that you're actually helping them to grow as individuals. We want the people who are involved with their community to look at them holistically, so that they take responsibility for themselves and that they engage in a conversation that helps them to progress on their journey. And you could also use case studies to highlight skaters who've made mistakes, and contrast that with good practice to help to raise awareness. Okay, so don't be frightened of tackling some of the harder issues. Right, let's leaders. Right, right. Now, leaders are really important, and this is a role that, to some extent, this course is actually designed to encourage this type of person to actually exist. All sessions should have a duly qualified leader appointed for each session, and the leader may be a head coach or another suitably qualified person. Okay, so for example, Mary, Olivia, Grant and Lucy, Bronwyn, if you were to say what would be my dream outcome out of this, is that potentially in the future that all of you could become leaders of inclusive skating sessions. That for me would be absolutely brilliant. The leader may be the head coach, or it could be another suitably qualified person. And leaders should have an interest and experience in skating and working with children and vulnerable persons. They must understand the needs of the community and express a caring attitude. Can you see that person there? Do you recognise who she is? That person in the picture is Louisa Chatwin, and she's a very good friend of mine. She's absolutely amazing. She's done lots for us within inclusive skating, and she's also taken the team away for the Special Olympics. And you might have seen her recently on some of our online sessions. She was actually doing the inline skating, as well as being an ice skating coach, she's also an inline skating coach. And she's often a leader of sessions in Lammas, where she actually is based normally. So the leader must have a recognised first aid qualification and be checked for safeguarding. And the leaders should be registered with inclusive skating, and all references, qualifications, certificates should be checked and renewed where necessary. And the leaders should be encouraged to complete coaching courses, such as the free I Coach Kids online courses and the free Open University Coach Developer courses. These are all available to you for free. The I Coach one's available on the site, but we really encourage people to ensure continual training. Don't just qualify once at the beginning. Regard your training as a journey where you're actually continually improving your own knowledge and skills. And please record all the training, especially if you're a leader, on the Inclusive Skating platform. The leader's performance should be assessed annually using standard assessment and appraisal tools, using also feedback from the skaters and participants, and the implementation of their own professional development action plan. Now, that's something that's going to be really important, particularly as we move forward and we develop. And here is some of the things that I think that the leader should be responsible for. The leader should take the responsibility for providing a safe environment. They should have a phone and access to call the emergency services. They should have a first aid certified coach on site at all times. They've got to properly plan the activity, evaluate skaters for injury, self-harm, abuse, or incapacity. So they're the person that's actually making sure that each of the skaters is okay. Match or equate skaters. So make sure that when you're actually running them in training activities, that you don't have someone that's skating really fast with someone that's skating really slowly, or someone that needs, a guide. Make sure that you're actually putting the skaters into the correct group. Leaders should ensure that there are sufficient volunteer activity supporters available at all times to run the session. So again, that's looking at your ratios. Do you actually have enough people as part of the session that you're running, whether or not it's a club or whether it's a training session where the coach or the leader has purchased the ice? Make sure you've got enough people there available to run the session. Ensure that all your volunteers and coaches are adequately trained and safeguarding checked as necessary. Have a fire and emergency crisis management plan. So when you're at your rink, make sure that you know where the fire exit is, you know what the emergency response is, and make sure that you've got a crisis management plan in place. Know where the emergency buttons and the fire alarms are. Very often, a lot of the rinks nowadays do actually have emergency buttons. So for example, at Brayhead, we were very lucky that there was emergency buttons that I could press so that that would bring the emergency responders and the first aid team and call an ambulance as necessary. Make sure that you've got an evacuation procedure and meeting point identified. And the default that we advise is the car park outside, because that's a good place for everyone to be, because you've usually also got the cars. Make sure that you've got a first aid kit, EpiPen and the resus kit and trained personnel available in a prominent location. Because bearing in mind, particularly with those sorts of situations, you may only have a short time to react. So make sure you've got them available before you start. Make sure also that you've got appropriate insurance available and that the volunteers and coaches have adequate insurance. Now, inclusive skating provides insurance for all of our coaches and volunteers during all of our activities. So it costs us a lot of money, but it does actually mean that all the coaches are insured for all of our activities. And yes, I do think it's a good idea for coaches to have their own insurance, but we don't take any chances. All of our coaches are insured whilst they're actually doing any inclusive skating activities. And we've got third-party liability insurance cover available too. Have a volunteer designated to meet and greet all new participants and conduct the induction process. And remember, that can take quite a bit of time. And so make sure that you've got enough volunteers that are really good at that job. The person who thinks that they don't really matter might be one of the most important people there, because if they're good at social skills and introducing people safely and in a welcoming manner, then they might be the most important person to try to get that person on board. And in the last week or two, I've been doing a lot of Sport England sessions looking at the new 10-year strategy. And they really took on board what I was saying in relation to this welcome policy. So hopefully there might well also be some funding available to support the role of having like welcome ambassadors there to help to introduce people to new activities, especially if they've got additional needs. Make sure that you warn of the inherent risks in the sport. It might actually turn out that, you know, if you've got a person that's got osteogenesis imperfecta, it might not be a good idea for them to skate. So you might actually have to say to that person, I'm sorry, this isn't the sport for you, because if there's a risk of you falling and breaking bones, maybe, you know, it might not be a risk that you are wanting or willing to take. So make sure that you've warned that, yes, you may fall in skating and that you've warned of the inherent risks. Ensure that the facility provides adequate and proper equipment. Unfortunately, with inclusive skating, you know that we've got these lovely frames, which are really good. So make sure that you've got equipment, either they've brought themselves that is suitable, and maybe it's adjusted for height if they're wearing skates, and make sure they've got things like helmets and wrist guards and all the protective gear that they might need. And so that might take a bit of planning, because you might need to tell them before they come that that's what they're going to need. Ensure that the rink is safe. No skater should be allowed on the rink until the rink has been checked for safety. Now that has actually been quite important during COVID, because, for example, after one group is finished, we've actually had to make sure that everything has been sanitised before the next group gets in. And we've actually had places allocated for everyone to go to. So safety might actually be a quite wide range of things. It might be the ice surface, but it might also be to make sure that everything's been sanitised before people are allowed to go to their designated location. Ensure that there's adequate signposting and signage. So for example, if there's a one-way system in operation for COVID, everyone knows which way to go. Ensure that the changing facilities and toilets are clean and fit for purpose. A difficult ask in an ice rink, but do your best. Carry out a risk assessment. There is an inclusive skating risk assessment form available on the website, and I've put down suggested standard risks that within the inclusive skating, but the list is not exhaustive. So always make sure that you do your own risk assessment and that you review that risk assessment before and after each session, and make sure that you continually supervise and monitor each session. Other things to bear in mind when you're running a session for our skaters: ensure that the lighting is appropriate. Generally speaking, no flashing lights. There's far too many of them that have got epilepsy, or they could be badly affected in terms of sight or delayed response. So generally speaking, no flashing lights, but you want to get the lighting good enough that everyone can see without too much glare. So getting the lighting just right is usually quite a refined decision within each of the ice rinks. Make sure that the sound equipment is operational and that the volume is set appropriately. some people may want it up a bit higher, particularly if they're deaf, but you may also have like people who've got autism and they can't cope with too much sound. So make sure that if they, for example, have got sound issues, we've got very good helmets that are used by the builders that have got special, earmuffs within them. You've actually seen them, Lucy, because we brought them in at Braehead. So if you need them, that's the sort of ones to have with people that need both the helmet and they need ear protections. Make sure that you check all the balance frames and skating assistants where they're available. Make sure that they're all in working order and use them for the purposes for which they were designed, not as toys. Okay. Ensure that adequate helmets are available wherever possible, but do make sure that the skaters, the preferred approach is for them always to bring in their own helmets. Advise always the use of safety equipment and protective gear at all times. If you've got protective gear on, you're not going to get hurt, generally speaking. So try as much as possible to make sure that people are wearing protective gear. And that's particularly for off-ice activities when they're doing inline skating. Continually monitor the session and ensure that safety and session etiquette is maintained at all times. So once the session begins and you're the leader and you've got responsibility for the session, don't go off to the cafe to have a coffee. Make sure you're actually monitoring the session. Encourage all participants to register with Inclusive Skating as soon as possible and keep all records on the Inclusive Skating platform wherever possible and maintain confidentiality of all records. Because bear in mind, you've got duties in relation to GDPR. It's really not a good idea to have paper forms lying around unsupervised at any rink. That's in breach of data protection. So make sure that you maintain the confidentiality of all records and that you don't share in any information at all in relation to anyone. Encourage all participants to keep the information on the platform up to date and identify all persons who may be contacted in an emergency. Identify wherever possible all persons for safe release of children and vulnerable persons, because you don't know, for example, there may be a family dispute. I've come across that, many's a time, both at hospitals and elsewhere. Make sure that you only release the person to the appropriate person. So even if you've got a parent and someone's disappeared or something, and they say, oh, I've got to come and pick them up, don't let them go. Make sure that they only get released to the correct person. And ensure that the carers and parents remain with their skater and remain alert as to their needs and the needs of others at all times. Usually I find that the skating parents and carers are usually very good with their own people, but make sure that you're actually encouraging them to think not just of themselves, but of the needs of others. Because some people say, oh, but they want to play. And that might be, shouting from the top of their, lungs. That might not be appropriate for everyone. So you do have to try to have an education process so that they're aware both of their own charges needs, but of everyone else's. And parents and carers must ensure good behaviour by themselves and all participants within their charge at all times. Now, we've actually got that built into our code of conduct. All participants must comply with inclusive skating conduct for officials at all times. And very often the people that have actually been naughty haven't been the skaters, it's actually been the parents and carers. So it's true. So make sure that they're aware that they've actually got responsibilities too. Being able to take part within inclusive skating is a privilege. So make sure that they're aware that it's not something that they can abuse. They've got to make sure that they have got good high standards of behaviour as well. Ensure that there's a ramp in place for wheelchairs to access the rink. So that is something that you would expect the leader to do. So know where the wheelchair is if you need one, but also where the ramp is so that the wheelchair can get on or off the ice. So you'll see, like, for example, Grant and Lucy, when they come into the rink, we'll actually make sure that they come in through a specific entrance that's good access for them, and they come onto the rink through their particular access point, which is easier for them. All media relations should be handled by one designated person upon the direction of the leader. So in other words, you shouldn't be making press releases, willy-nilly. Make sure that if there is any press releases, that it's done properly and that you're not going to make comments to the media or bring inclusive skating into disrepute. The privacy of everyone should be assured. All media should be consented to, and no children should be interviewed by the media. That should always be done through the parent and carer and through their consent. Now, I put this one in at the end almost as an afterthought, and actually it's probably one of the most important things. particularly in the light of COVID. But this was drafted way before we actually thought about COVID. So I say ensure that all participants maintain high standards of hygiene and sanitation. All water bottles should be individually identified, and children should not share food or drink. Encourage healthy habits and good practices, such as washing hands as and when necessary. Who would have thought that that would be one of the most important things that we leave to our children in the light of COVID? Right, so that, because we're so close to the end, if we can just run on a little bit, what I want you to finally think about is evaluation and review. Make sure that whenever you're running your sessions, that you've got a system of feedback in place and available for all participants. And make sure that you've got a system of reviewing all the feedback. So people don't just say something, but you actually read what it is that they've said and that you actually, process it. Make sure that you've got a complaint system and you've got an independent investigation process in place or available when necessary. And make sure that you know how to report and escalate issues when appropriate. Always use feedback and review to improve systems and improve the design of any future programs. And make sure that if you're making improvements, that you communicate them to all participants, because sometimes they can really be quite chuffed if one of the reasons why you implemented a gender neutral changing room is because someone highlighted the fact that you often had males and females in needing to be in the same changing room, right? So if you've actually implemented it because someone else has suggested it, go back to them and say, look, we thought that was such a good idea, we've done what you suggested. Okay, and what that does is it facilitates an open dialogue and involvement with others in future program design. Right, and a final video.
Her confidence has soared, and we push her in this field because it's something that we know she can achieve. You almost feel free to be who you want to be, that you haven't got to hide any issues or anything, it's just be who you want to be, and I think that makes you confident, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Being able to express yourself.
Great. So you've now got an end of course assessment to do. Okay, so that's the end of the formal learning modules. I would ask you all to read the safety policy because it basically does all of that. Everything that's within this course is covered again in the safety policy. So make sure that you read that, recap the main messages and prepare for your assessment. Remember always that you've got a significant influence on the community. You can actually help to significantly promote a safe environment, and you've got the ability to really encourage others to make good, responsible decisions. So don't underestimate the role that you can potentially have as a safety advisor. You're actually helping to improve safety by taking part in the course and also taking on board what you've learned. Say, for example, you've got an understanding of the accreditation policy so that you encourage people to make sure that they're always going to remain with their family and their carers and spread the word. If, for example, it's classification, make sure that you tell people, look, your needs can be met. And the best way of actually sharing good practices is by people communicating that by word of mouth. So you can have quite a powerful influence. Now, in relation to your assessment, there is actually a series of assessments based on the e-learning programme, and you can find it in the section where it says quiz under next steps, and there's two links, one for the assessment and one for the certificate. Now, there's a whole range of different types of activities, and so some of them are simple, like yes or no, true or false type things, but other ones are a bit more complicated where you've got like a lot of matching to do. So you don't have to get absolutely everything correct. The pass mark is set at 85%, and you can keep redoing the exam at the end, but make sure that once you're happy with what you've done, that you submit the whole thing, and it's organised on the basis of a Moodle. So you do actually have to complete the whole thing. If you keep going back and checking, you kind of upset the system a little bit. So if you've got checks, what I'd recommend you do is submit. And then if you want to redo it because you find that you got a couple wrong and you got 95% or 85%, take the whole thing as a complete assessment. and you can find out if you're getting more right or less right at the end. Now, once you pass the exam, then you get put onto our list of accredited safety advisors, and you can also get a certificate which is downloadable. So I would strongly recommend that you actually do that. So far, I think if I'm right in thinking, we've got 49 inclusive skating safety advisors. So I'm looking for 50. Okay, so one of you might be the person that's going to be the 50th person to pass the assessment. Okay. So I think in actual fact, that's the link there for the exam. Let's see if it, right. Okay. So you can tell the number of times that I've done this with people, right? So it will tell you how many times that you've actually done it and how you can actually do it. We go to settings and then how you actually take the course. Okay. Now, obviously what you'll need to do is I'm going to stop the share. There we are. Stop share. Now, obviously, I can't do it just now because you need to log on to your own system, because when you're taking the exam, you want to take it in your name, because when you pass the certificate, the system will automatically put your name on the certificate and not mine. So you actually want to be taking the certificate in your own time. Now, I don't know if any of you got any additional learning support needs, but if we've got people that have got, for example, dyslexia and they need a reader, or they've got a vision impairment, we can put in place additional learning support for people to be able to take the exam. So if that affects you or affects anyone that you know of, if you could possibly share that with them, that we're actually very happy to give them additional support, that would be great. Good. We've covered a huge amount of work, so huge well done to everyone.